In the searing summer of 2011, the Appalachian Mountains, ancient and formidable, held their breath. This was no ordinary wilderness. It was a sprawling emerald labyrinth where mist clung to the ridges like secrets refusing to be told. It was into this majestic yet menacing expanse of the Rowan Highlands that Elias Cole, 37, a history teacher whose voice often carried the quiet reverence of forgotten places, and his wife, Marissa, 34, a nurse seeking solace from the sterile hum of hospital grief, ventured. What began as a promised 10-day escape, a balm for their souls, would unravel into a chilling legend. Elias, with his thoughtful gaze and deep love for the echoes of the past, often told his students that these mountains whispered more stories than any textbook could hold. Tales of settlers lost, hermits unseen, and wanderers swallowed whole by the endless woods. Marissa, yearning for a silence that could cleanse the weariness of long shifts and the lingering sorrow of her profession, found in the wilderness a gentler rhythm. Together, they were a perfect counterpoint, his boundless curiosity, her steadfast calm. The mountains had become their sacred refuge. On July 3, 2011, under a sky pregnant with summer heat, they packed their Subaru. A lightweight tent, 2 sleeping bags, a week's worth of trail provisions, and Elias's ever-present notebooks for his sketches and thoughts. Deliberately, they left their phones in the glove compartment, a silent pact to detach, to truly disappear from the clamor of the world, if only for a little while. Their last touch with civilization was a flickering gas station at the foothills. The clerk remembered Marissa's easy smile as she brought trail mix, and Elias's focused intensity, his finger tracing a path on a worn map, venturing beyond the familiar into the unmarked. At Carver's Gap trailhead, they locked the car, a final severance from the world they knew, and stepped into the profound green silence of the forest. The air was thick and humid, cicadas thrumming a relentless, invisible symphony. The oppressive heat weighed on the shoulders like an unseen burden. A fellow hiker, a young college student on a day climb, caught a fleeting glimpse of them that morning. He recalled Marissa's vibrant red bandana, a splash of color against the deep greens, and Elias's, asking about a rarely used logging road junction? They seemed content, he mused, people who knew their destination. But they never reached the Appalachian Trail shelters where they had planned to camp, where their family expected them. When their return date came and went, a cold dread began to seep in. The Subaru remained, untouched, a stark sentinel at the trailhead. Inside, their wallets, driver's licenses, both cell phones, batteries drained, but undisturbed. To the investigators, the message was chillingly clear. Elias and Marissa had not fled. They had every intention of coming back. Within hours, the quiet urgency exploded into a frantic region-wide search. Helicopters, like desperate metallic birds, sliced through the green canopy. Volunteers, grim-faced, combed the ancient ridges in relentless lines. Dogs, their noses to the earth, followed a scent that led to that old logging road, only to vanish into nothingness, as if the very air had swallowed the trail. Night after night, the searchers returned, their hopes dwindling with each empty-handed retreat. By late August, the official search scaled back, but the families, haunted and relentless, refused to let their loved ones become just another lost story. Whispers began to snake through the small mountain towns below, tales of hidden caves, of reclusive figures guarding forgotten hollows, of an unforgiving wilderness that resented trespassers who dared to venture too deep. As summer bled into autumn, the mountains, indifferent and ancient, swallowed Elias and Marissa whole, leaving behind only the chilling echoes of unanswered questions. The disappearance of Elias and Marissa Cole became a haunting refrain, one of the most unsettling mysteries in recent Appalachian history. By the desolate winter of 2011, search parties had scoured nearly every mapped trail, every ravine, every frozen riverbank in the Rowan Highlands. Hundreds of volunteers had trudged through mud, thicket, and fog, their desperate calls swallowed by a silence that gave nothing back. Rangers spoke of it with a bewildered shake of the head. It was as if the couple had simply walked straight into the trees and dissolved from the earth. This baffling absence fueled countless theories, each more shadowed than the last. And as the unforgiving grip of time tightened, those theories began to twist, to curdle into the chilling fabric of folklore.
The first explanation to circulate, whispered with a desperate hope, was the simplest: an accident. The mountains, beautiful as they were also notorious for their sudden, treacherous shifts in weather, for cliffs concealed by a treacherous embrace of undergrowth, and for sinkholes that seemed to swallow sound itself, erasing all trace. Locals, their voices hushed with generations of wilderness knowledge, suggested Elias and Marissa might have stumbled into a hidden crevice, or perhaps a vast unseen cave system, their bodies vanishing from both the sweeping eyes of helicopters and the determined boots of ground patrols. Searchers had rappelled into several deep chasms, only to find the cold comfort of moss, the whisper of water, and an echoing silence. There were no torn scraps of clothing, no skeletal remains, not even the faint, telltale chemical scent of decay. Slowly, reluctantly, the rangers began to doubt the accident theory, even as it remained the least terrifying of all the possibilities. Then came another suggestion, born of the wild's primal nature: wildlife. Black bears roamed the highlands, powerful and unpredictable. While attacks were rare, there were chilling accounts of hikers mauled for straying too close to a cub, for disturbing the ancient rhythm of the woods. But bears, when they claimed a life, left indelible signs: scattered belongings, deep claw marks, the unmistakable brutal violence of a predator. Yet the Colds' carefully packed campsite had never been found. No trace of their belongings surfaced. A predator explanation offered little true comfort. Some, grasping at any logical thread, believed the couple had chosen to disappear willingly. Elias, with his love of history and a quiet fascination with survival tales, might have persuaded Marissa to abandon society, to embrace a life lived off the land. Investigators meticulously examined this theory, but it quickly crumbled under the harsh light of scrutiny. Elias and Marissa had left their wallets, their IDs, credit cards, and most of their food in the car. They held steady jobs, cherished close family ties, and displayed no signs of debt or any impending crisis. They weren't running from anything. Marissa's sister, her voice thick with anguish, told reporters they were running toward the mountains, but only for a vacation. They would never have left us behind. That left the most unsettling explanation of all: human foul play. The old trails of the Rowan Highlands were not merely paths. They were veins threading through private land, abandoned logging routes that twisted like forgotten scars, and the crumbling remnants of long-gone homesteads. Locals, their eyes heavy with a mixture of wisdom and fear, spoke to investigators of a man who lived alone in a collapsing shack, a phantom figure who appeared and vanished along the timber roads. Some called him a hermit, a harmless recluse. Others claimed he was an embittered former logger, his heart hardened by hikers trespassing too close to his secluded domain. Search teams methodically scouted every known cabin, but found only ghosts. Ruins where chimneys stood sentinel over vanished roofs, tin shacks slowly rusting back into the earth. Yet the stories persisted, of strange noises carried on the night wind, the metallic clatter of chains, the faint rhythmic hammering of tools echoing through the thick fog. Search dogs, their instincts honed, picked up fleeting scents, strong one moment, then utterly gone the next, as if whatever trail they followed simply dissolved into thin air.
By the end of 2012, the official search had slowed to the bureaucratic crawl of paperwork and cold files. What had begun as a missing persons case began to curdle into legend, a tale whispered with unease in nearby towns. The woods themselves seemed to grow heavier with it, as if the silence was not empty at all, but rather waiting. And through it all, Elias and Marissa remained lost, their absence forming a hollow in the vast landscape that no map could ever chart. 3 long summers passed, each one deepening the mystery, before the mountains finally surrendered their first real clue. It was late August of 2014, a season when the Appalachians wore a heavy, verdant cloak, when afternoon storms brewed on the horizon and lightning frequently tore at the ridgelines. That was when Earl Whitaker, a 52-year-old logger with a face etched by sun and wind and hands calloused from decades of labor, was dispatched to clear fallen timber. His assignment took him along an old service road, a barely remembered trek that wound far beyond any marked hiking trail, deep into the forgotten country. Earl had spent his entire life working these woods, and he knew, with an instinct forged over decades, when a place felt wrong. He would later recall that the air seemed unnaturally still, as if the very trees were holding their breath. His chainsaw sputtered and groaned as he cut through a massive downed oak, and in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, his gaze snagged on something. Half hidden behind a dense curtain of ivy and aggressive blackberry bramble, he perceived the faint outline of a shack, sagging, gray, the kind of crude structure long erased from county maps. Driven by a primal curiosity, Earl pushed closer, brambles tearing at his denim jeans, until he stood before what had once been a hunting cabin. Its windows were now black, vacant voids, its door hanging crooked on a rust-bitten hinge. But it wasn't the dilapidated cabin that froze him in place, stealing his breath. It was the thing standing just behind it, squatting ominously in the deep shadows, like some obscene, forgotten monument.
What Earl Whitaker discovered was an iron cage, 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and just tall enough for a person to stand within, its bars grievously eaten through with rust. Heavy, ancient chains hung from its corners, and a padlock the size of Earl's fist dangled uselessly from a loop of corroded metal, its purpose served and forgotten by time. For a long, horrifying moment, Earl's mind grappled with the image, trying to reconcile it as some kind of trap, perhaps for animals. But then, through the dim light filtering through the overgrown trees, he discerned the shapes within. 2 long, silent bundles, wrapped in faded, filthy sleeping bags, were curled against the rusted bars, as if huddled desperately for a warmth that would never come. And then the smell reached him, faint at first, then unmistakable, the dry, sweet reek of decay that clung to old soil, a stench that spoke of death and long abandonment. Earl staggered back, a wave of bile rising in his throat. His hands trembled violently as he fumbled for his phone, his call to the sheriff's office nearly incoherent with shock and revulsion. But the raw urgency in his voice was undeniable, bringing deputies and state investigators racing up the winding logging road within hours. They hacked through the dense undergrowth with machetes, their grim faces pushing into the clearing to confirm Earl's unspeakable nightmare. Inside the cage lay the skeletal remains of two people. Their bones were tangled within the remnants of sleeping bags, as if they had been carefully laid down side by side, wrapped tight, and then left behind like forgotten refuse. The forensic teams, meticulous and grim, documented every inch of the cabin and its macabre cage. The crude structure had been reinforced over the years, nails driven in at odd angles, boards scavenged from other ruins, rope knotted where hinges had failed. Each crude repair a testament to a dark, deliberate intent. Nearby, investigators found rusted tins of beans, a cracked enamel mug, and the charred remnants of a camp stove. Someone had lived here. Someone had built that cage not as a trap for animals, but as a cruel prison for human beings. The days following the discovery of Elias and Marissa Cole's remains were a blur of flashing lights and grim determination. Law enforcement vehicles crawled up the forgotten logging roads, forensic tents were pitched starkly in the clearing, and investigators in their stark white suits combed over every inch of the ruin that locals now simply called the Cage Cabin. What had once been just another forgotten shack, reclaimed by ivy and decay, was now a crime scene that seemed to ooze menace from its very boards. Deputies assigned to stand guard at night confessed to a chilling unease. One described feeling as though the trees pressed closer at night, whispering in the wind, the looming cage behind him, a silent, accusing witness.
Inside, forensic specialists worked with meticulous patience. The cage itself, though corroded, was not ancient. Metallurgists estimated it had been constructed, or at least heavily reinforced, sometime in the late 1990s or early 2000s. The welds were sloppy, yet deliberate, suggesting someone with rudimentary metalwork skills, perhaps a welder or a logger accustomed to rough utilitarian repairs. The padlock, a cheap mass-produced item from a hardware store chain, was weathered enough to suggest years of exposure to the elements. Whoever had locked Elias and Marissa inside had harbored no intention of their release. But it was the cabin itself that held the most disturbing secrets. Beneath layers of dust and mildew were fragments of a life, or perhaps the fragments of many lives. Investigators catalogued everything. A pile of rusted canned goods with expiration dates stretching back more than a decade. A wood stove patched haphazardly with tin sheets. A lantern blackened with soot. In one corner, they found a milk crate stacked high with notebooks, their pages warped and fragile from damp. The writing was erratic, sentences spiraling into obsession, scrawled in jagged block letters. They come here uninvited, they take and they leave, they don't belong. Another entry read, "You can't trust the ones from the cities. They'll poison the land if you let them." The entries jumped jarringly between bitter rants against outsiders and incoherent ramblings about the mountains themselves, as if the writer believed the forest was a living, vengeful entity. Most chilling of all were the maps. Spread across a warped, splintered table were topographic charts of the Appalachian region, each one annotated with angry red ink. Certain trails were circled, others violently crossed out. A few bore cryptic notes scrawled in that same obsessive hand.
Serious, immersive narrator with moderate pacing, subtle emotional shifts, and tonal variations for characters to build suspense and atmosphere. The chilling discovery began to reveal its full, terrifying scope. These trails, so often walked by the carefree, bore a sinister secret. Within the meticulously kept notebooks, beside the chilling notation, "Good ground," a jagged red X was scrawled near the Rowan Islands, the very place where Elias and Marissa had vanished into thin air. The implication was a gut punch. Someone had been watching, tracking the innocent passage of hikers, marking their movements with predatory precision. Then came the photographs, a packet of faded Polaroids tucked within one of the grim journals. Though time had softened their edges, the images remained hauntingly clear. Each depicted unsuspecting hikers. Some beamed with fully laden packs, others were captured mid-stride on a sun-dappled path, and one paused, head tilted back, to drink from a rushing stream. Not a single face betrayed an awareness of the clandestine lens upon them. Investigators tirelessly cross-referenced these faces with missing persons reports, but to no avail. No match. "We don't know who they are," an FBI agent confessed to the waiting press, his voice heavy with the weight of the unknown. "But we know they didn't take those pictures themselves." A grim consensus began to form. Elias and Marissa were not the first to step into the shadow of whatever malevolence lurked in these woods. They were simply the unfortunate ones whose story had finally, agonizingly come to light. The autopsies, when they arrived, deepened the horror to an unbearable degree. The medical examiner's findings painted a picture of slow, agonizing despair. Elias and Marissa had succumbed to starvation and exposure, likely within weeks of their abduction. There were no bullet wounds, no shattered bones, no telltale signs of direct assault. They had not been brutally attacked, but instead had been caged, left alive to waste away, then abandoned to the elements. Their sleeping bags, once symbols of adventure and optimism, packed in 2011, had become their final, pathetic shrouds. For their families, this knowledge was a cruel torment. The agonizing thought that their loved ones had suffered a drawn-out, lonely demise within earshot of the forest's endless, indifferent silence, while the world outside continued, oblivious as if they had never existed.
The FBI's psychological profile began to sketch a chilling portrait. The architect of these cryptic notebooks was likely a male somewhere in his 50s to 70s, a shadow who had dwelled in these parts for years, perhaps a former logger or miner, intimately familiar with the labyrinthine backcountry routes. His fragmented writings hinted at a mind consumed by paranoia, simmering resentment, and possibly an untreated mental illness. He appeared to see himself as a solitary guardian, defending the mountains from what he perceived as intruders, casting himself in the dual role of warden and judge. The cage, it became chillingly clear, was no desperate improvisation, but an iron-forged extension of his twisted ideology. Yet, despite weeks of exhaustive searching, no concrete suspect materialized. Neighbors and townsfolk vaguely recalled a handful of isolated men from decades past, but most had either died or long since vanished. Every lead, every whisper, unraveled into nothing.
As investigators painstakingly sifted through the wreckage of this desolate mystery, the locals exchanged hushed, knowing glances. Some swore they knew the culprit, an old recluse rumored to have once brandished a shotgun at unwary hikers. Others pointed to a spectral drifter, seen pushing a cart of scrap metal down forgotten back roads. Still others claimed the mountains themselves had a way of cultivating their own phantoms, suggesting that whoever built the cage had long since melted into the forest, disappearing like smoke. For the families of Elias and Marissa, this agonizing uncertainty was a wound that refused to close. They had answers, yes, but no true closure. A crime without a criminal, a phantom tormentor. When the forensic teams finally packed away their grim tools, and the cabin was left to the mournful silence of the wilderness, it stood as a jagged, indelible scar. Crime scene tape, a fluttering banner of official despair, whipped from the eaves, snapping in the unforgiving wind. Everyone knew it wouldn't last. Already whispers circulated among hunters and morbidly curious hikers, daring each other to venture forth and gaze upon the cage for themselves. Officials issued stern warnings, but the legend had already taken root, a dark seed in fertile ground. The notebooks, the maps, the photographs, they painted a chilling portrait of someone meticulous, infinitely patient, and profoundly disturbed. And the most terrifying thought of all lingered over every single briefing. If he had dedicated such meticulous time to watching hikers, to marking maps, to forging a cage with his own hands, then Elias and Marissa might not have been the only ones. They were simply the ones whose prison had finally been discovered. The official closing of the investigation into the Cole disappearance brought no solace. If anything, it deepened the pervasive unease that had settled like an icy mist over the Rowan Highlands. On paper, the case remained open but inactive. A bulging file crammed with crime scene photos, coroner's reports, and those ragged, chilling notebooks retrieved from the cabin. In grim reality, investigators conceded they had little left to pursue. The man who had built the cage, if he still drew breath, had vanished as completely as Elias and Marissa once had. For the grieving families, the cruel absence of a face, a name, even a single confirmed suspect, was a festering wound that stubbornly refused to heal.
The unbearable weight of memory finally forced Elias's parents to leave North Carolina. Every shifting shadow in the tree line a cruel whisper of their son's name. Marissa's sister, however, became a quiet yet unyielding force, a tireless advocate for cold case funding. She reminded anyone who would listen, her voice firm with sorrow and conviction, that the cage did not simply materialize. Someone had forged it, someone had locked it, and someone had walked away, leaving two lives to fade into the mountain's indifferent embrace. The cage cabin itself, a stark monument to terror, became a magnet for both fear and morbid fascination. Though law enforcement had crudely boarded its windows and plastered warning signs, its location seeped out through hushed conversations in dimly lit bars and at desolate trailheads, perpetuated by blurry, illicit photos uploaded to obscure online forums. Adventurous hikers whispered of it in the same breath as ancient ghost lights and chilling witch legends, daring one another to seek out the very spot where the Coles had drawn their final agonizing breaths. Some returned with unsettling tales, strange disembodied noises in the dense canopy, the phantom echo of rattling chains, the distinct sound of footsteps pacing just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. Others swore they found fresh claw marks etched into the rusted bars, though investigators, clinging to rationality, insisted these were merely the ravages of rust and weathering. The rational explanation, however, never truly resonated. The cage was no longer mere evidence. It had transcended into a terrifying relic, a symbol of unspeakable dread. Journalists descended in ravenous waves. Documentaries, crafted with an eye for the macabre, framed the case as a modern folk horror story, lingering on haunting shots of the cage being slowly consumed by ivy, juxtaposing Elias and Marissa's youthful, smiling faces with the vast, indifferent emptiness of the forest. Podcasts endlessly debated. Were the Coles the victims of a solitary, disturbed hermit, or were they merely pawns in something far grander, a sinister network of watchers who viewed hikers as nothing more than unsuspecting prey? Each retelling subtly shifted the legend further from the brutal facts, until the locals found themselves surrounded not only by unanswered questions, but by an encroaching, unsettling myth. The people of Rowan Mountain grew weary of outsiders arriving with their cameras and their tape recorders, asking about the ghost cage as though it were some morbid roadside attraction. They reminded anyone who would listen, their voices laced with a quiet defiance, that 2 young lives had been brutally extinguished there, and that no one had ever been held accountable.
For law enforcement, the discovery ignited a ripple of profound dread. Investigators quietly began the arduous task of reviewing old cases. Hikers who had vanished over the past 3 decades, entire families swallowed without a trace, campers whose remains were never definitively located. Many of these files remained as cold and unforgiving as the mountain streams that carved through the valleys. Had they all been mere accidents, claimed by unforgiving rivers and precipitous cliffs? Or had some unseen, malevolent hand guided them into traps just like the Coles? The chilling Polaroids found in the cabin suggested a far greater toll than just 2 victims, yet none of those haunting faces were ever identified. Agents who had pored over the cryptic notebooks admitted later that the writings still haunted their sleepless nights. The voice within those mildew-scented pages was so utterly convinced of its own righteousness, so devoid of doubt, as though caging 2 human beings and abandoning them to die had not been an act of monstrous cruelty, but a sacred, twisted purpose. Eventually, the cabin itself surrendered to the relentless assault of time and weather. Heavy storms tore away its fragile roof. Ivy, a verdant strangler, choked its decaying walls, and the ravenous forest began its slow, inevitable reclamation of the ground where the cage once stood. But the legend, far more resilient, outlived the ruin. Locals still gesture towards that ridge with an enduring unease, warning newcomers not to stray too far from the main trails. Hunters share hushed stories of hearing disembodied laughter echoing through the ancient pines, though no one else is ever there. Hikers speak of a pervasive presence that follows just out of sight, heavy footsteps that inexplicably vanish the moment they dare to turn. The cage itself, though now rusted and broken, remained defiantly upright long after the cabin had crumbled, a skeletal framework of iron that simply refused to fall. Some said that was fitting. It had once held death, and death, they believed, still clung to it, a dark, and indelible stain.
For the families, this encroaching legend was an unbearable burden. To them, Elias and Marissa were not abstract symbols of Appalachian folklore, but a beloved brother, a cherished daughter, a child whose unborn future had been cruelly stolen. They spoke at vigils, their voices piercing through the encroaching myth, reminding listeners that behind the chilling tales were two vibrant people who had been denied their very existence. They were not ghosts, Marissa's sister once declared at a somber gathering, her voice trembling but resolute. They were alive. They laughed. They worked. They dreamed. Someone put them in that cage and left them there. Don't forget that. But as the years relentlessly wore on, the public's memory began to grasp the story more than the people. The Coles became shorthand for the inherent dangers of the mountains, a chilling campfire tale whispered in the flickering glow of firelight. And so, the story of Elias and Marissa Cole lingers, unfinished, a perpetual question mark etched into the wilderness. No one has ever been charged. The notebooks still rest in evidence boxes, their pages still damp with the scent of mildew, their words still crawling with the insidious tendrils of paranoia. The Polaroids remain sealed, each face a haunting mystery that may never be solved. Somewhere within the vast, ancient sweep of the Appalachian Range, perhaps the builder of the cage died alone, his bones slowly sinking into the same unforgiving soil that claimed his victims. Or perhaps he still walks among the shadowed ridges, a fleeting figure glimpsed at the very edge of the tree line, perpetually waiting. The mountains, after all, keep their secrets exceptionally well, and for those who dare to venture too deep, the profound silence of the forest is not always empty. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it remembers, and sometimes it simply refuses to let go.